Actually, 500.
500 now. Okay.
Right.
So the question is, how did they,
But then
why
after,
did they do that? I mean, what was it? Was it Bruce Dodge who was just
Well, he had to
awesome?
fight hard to do it.
Well, it's
He
how
got
did
turned down by their committee.
right. So the
As
question,
he
how
went
did
to the
that,
full partnership.
how did that work? What was the dynamic to
well,
say, guess what, we want to give you $500,000 to litigate
over
this
lunch,
case?
or we'll talk about this since I was there.
You were there.
I was there,
Okay, good.
including the famous.
No, I don't know anybody. I'm Jonathan Zaslow.
Hi, Jonathan. I've seen you written some stuff about. Well, so a really fun story tonight. Get ready for the next panel. So this goes before we filed. We went to the EWP building. I guess it's traditional civil litigation to go and say, hey, we're going to sue you. Can we settle? So it's Bruce and myself and David Gaines and Tim Such. And when they 14th floor, a lot of stuffed leather, and they said, our last DWP was saying to us with their general managers and the attorney says, our last litigation took 50 years. It was the San Fernando case, right? Bruce turned to us, and we were pretty scruffy. I mean, David Gaines, I don't know if are you just, So David, my hair was a little longer, the whole thing, and he looked at us and he goes, we're all young men now, aren't we?
So that's in John's
But
book.
that's in the book. But,
Oh, yeah.
But what about the question is how Bruce got authority
It took 3 different tries.
from the
What was the winning argument? What was the argument?
got Buffalo to do it?
I think, here's who doesn't get the credit. It was David Brower.
Yes,
It was Friends
that
of
would
the
be
Year.
better.
That's who found it. It wasn't Audubon. The relationship was very much David Brower, Andrew Baldwin, Tony Rossman, Tony actually
support and the sponsorship. Really
they're
makes
the
a
ones
huge difference
who
just to be able
helped
to
him.
like
They're the ones who have the relationship with
board
more
staff to
support.
attend if they otherwise couldn't. My pleasure.
No. And in fact, the decision, again, the meeting where Audubon and Friends of the Earth were there, and the decision.
That's a low podium. Okay.
Plaintiff.
You got good eyes.
Yeah. Right, and they had their more conservative had the resources to raise money, even though they made it the obligation of all. But in terms of getting Mofo and convincing him, it was I think it was that relationship that was important. And then Bruce Dodge's. So. No, I understand. No, I
Okay, looks like we're all sitting up here.
yeah, good. No, that was the idea. That I'm supposed to make sure we all are up, so that we. So you should go. Why don't you?
I see my name card here.
Oh,
Happy to.
okay. So we also going to have a clicker. Yeah. Well. Oh.
An advantage of the podium, I think, is you can see your own slides.
Yeah.
For those of us who have
And
several.
we're going to be clicking. You're going to have a clicker.
But whatever you like
Hey,
is
Mike.
good.
I'm actually going to. I hopefully have the time. And we'll talk a little bit. I'm going to talk about the modeling subgroup and seriously the
I thought
importance.
you and I would have a session.
No.
Story.
Yeah. No. Right.
Committee, so if I can
Oh, thank you.
that would be great.
Anyway, I just wanted to say hello.
Yeah. No, but stay tuned. I won't name. I'm not going to name names, but I'll name the process.
Don't worry.
No. But
Whatever.
Right.
Good luck. Hey, Peter.
Yeah. So I think.
Naming names.
No, I am going to actually mention Phil Connell.
Yeah.
What's that? Yeah.
Marty, he's sitting on
Yeah.
the end here.
So I'm going to go get something to drink and go to the bathroom. So don't start with it.
Okay, we won't be back on time, I guess, is the.
Yeah.
Hi, Mary. Hi, I'm Jordan Diamond. I work with Mike.
Very nice
So
to
the
meet
ED of Police. Do you have everything you need? Anything?
I think so. Yeah, I heard that there's sweet somebody here. I don't know.
Martha. It's all Martha.
Yes.
Do it if not, but
No, so there is a. Where did the.
so it just is.
Oh, gee, that looks dramatic. Okay.
except for me. I'm the beginning, and I'm going to be much less than that. Yeah, or it might go on and on. You just never know.
There's an interpretive brine shrimp dance out there somewhere still. So.
Hey. We're going to put that one away for now. For the time being.
Okay, not for today.
It's a
Sorry.
long story.
Sorry.
Please, for another half hour.
Yeah.
Okay, and I'll let the speakers know. We're local. That's going to be great. Missed that? That's why I was surprised that Michael Hanneman was, telling people how much speakers were asking him how much time they had left. So I thought, maybe there's one.
Well, so I think they tried putting it down at the foot for this one, the first panel. I think it was my favorite for that. So they made that
I think having it right in front of them is probably good. And then some sense of the ultimate when the panel is over, so we go to
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I was standing out there, I saw you earlier, and I've seen your newsletter, your picture, and you signed notes.
I'm the only man standing on the original program. It's Birmingham's in Washington. Entirely Jim Kennedy is Israel. He's not here. Mark Eater over from him. Scott Stein knows him. I know, but this last weekend I've been getting calls all the time. Hi, Mary.
Hi, I'm well, thank
Nice to
you.
see you.
Nice to see you.
Yeah, I didn't expect to learn.
No, it's always
Ed
interesting.
Manning letter. Did you know about that?
I knew that he had made the original contact, but I didn't know that it was successful.
The guy's sitting there and it's tied in well, we reached out to the gay community. Why don't we reach out to the
That part was new to me, completely new.
That's amazing.
No, I thought it was very interesting. But I'm so glad you could make it, and thank you for being the lone man standing on the first panel.
Is there a board meeting for the UC Davis? Frank, what happened to that?
Got rescheduled, and I'm not sure. I think it's going to be after the first year now. No, there has not. I'm not really sure why. I guess. Kind of. And then if you have a little bit. It haunts you.
Maybe there would be better discussion. And I don't know if that's about the 3 or 4 months inquiry about, because we want to and it was inquiring about the possibility of No, okay.
Sorry about that.
Should we test the remote? No, no problem.
That was great meeting you for all many, many years. Like I said, receiving notes from you. So
We talked on the phone, we have a system, you know, and like they come to me when I know somebody. Anyway, my next one will say it's great.
Great.
The red light works on this. I actually don't show on what.
the ones that are about a lot of public trust stuff, which I'm not all the way sure about. That's not historic trust, which I know you're on the advisory. Correct.
It's right here, right? Yeah,
So, but I'm not a lawyer.
measured dose of that is right now.
All right. Is it quicker?
Okay.
You're thinking first, right?
So thank
I
you.
am first. Thank you. It's great to meet
My
you.
pleasure. My pleasure.
Okay, it seems to work pretty effectively on like this side of the room, just without having to point. If you kind of get over here more, you kind of point over there.
Okay.
That.
I believe our instructions are to use the left
Okay.
turn, so I should be in good
Okay,
shape.
so it
Is
should,
that right?
yeah, it should be. Probably.
I think I have one of these in our office, so
It's not, I'll.
that's not going to work out.
No, I haven't switched it back. It's on the computer.
No, I was the laser pointer.
Oh, the laser.
But that's not a good screen. I don't think I need it anyway.
Yeah,
so
that's okay. They advised me to not use the laser because it's on webcast and you can't see it.
You can't see it anyway.
Yeah.
It
Okay.
looks like you can't even see it.
Yeah.
The dots.
Okay.
Perfect. Thank you.
And everybody gets it.
All right. All right.
All you take Jeff and Chris in next time. I don't have it down yet. I'm working on it.
So did I get my imitate your favorite Eastern Sierra character?
Oh, that'd be a great idea.
Yeah. For yours? I asked if they had. Mic check. Mic check.
We need confirmation of the correct pronunciation of Justice Blease or Blease? Blease. Please. Okay. Perfect. Thank you.
So Mary's here, right?
She is. And our timer is.
Oh, geez.
Ten?
He was actually, asked me a few questions. Then he would open it up, said, "Do not open it up."
I will tell everybody. I will tell everybody.
Well, he's, all we got to do is talk to Lester now. That's why. No, we don't. We don't. No interest in that. You're Dr. Mark Drew.
I have a script, but I can't do it anyway, so. Are you the cameraman on the show?
There's a number of them.
I am not the cameraman.
You're going to do a lot of I'm going to somehow.
Does it happen to have a pointer on it by chance?
It does have a link, but they said it won't come up.
Hey, Jeff, let me see the clicker. Let me see the clicker. I want to see how the pointer is.
As soon as our panelists are in their seats, we will begin.
It doesn't show on the screen either, but that's still pretty good. I'm glad I wasn't planning on having one, so.
Okay.
45 minutes for you.
All right, I'm not going to make any more promises about starting exactly on the minute, but the cat herding is going almost according to plan. Thank you very much. It's relatively easy today. It's relatively easy today to acknowledge all of our speakers who are participating in the event. They're all thought leaders who have deep experience in the Mono Basin cases themselves or carry great responsibility for their implementation. Of course, most of you are no doubt here in no small part because of the truly remarkable quality of the cast of characters that we've assembled today. But in some ways, it's more interesting and more telling to acknowledge you, our audience. Over 200 people are here, and with the magic of the internet, it could be thousands more tuning in from afar. Attorneys, environmental and water professionals of all stripes, scholars, and crucially, students who represent the next generation of that will grapple with the challenges of balancing human and environmental needs for water, all comprise this crowd. I want to note in particular that over 20 members of the staff of the state board itself are participating here today. And I'm also told that we have almost a dozen legislative staffers here. These both are crucial indicators of the deep and abiding interest and the importance of our topics today. So we're grateful to all of you for joining us. Now on to session 2, which will examine the outlook for Mono Lake and its creeks. This session has generously been sponsored by ESA, and our moderator today is Mary Schoonover. Mary is the Executive Vice President of the Resources Legacy Fund. She previously was Deputy Attorney General representing the State Lands Commission in the Mono Lake cases, Owens Lake, and other cases. Thank you, Mary.
Good morning. There have been no changes on our panel, so we feel like we've already been wildly successful this morning. We'll take those victories as we can get them. I worked with Jan Stevens, Michael Valentine, and David Carl through the preliminary injunction hearings and the 40 days and 40 nights, seemingly of biblical proportion, of the State Water Resources Control Board hearings. Although we worked very hard, after the decisions were issued, we pretty much went home and resumed our lives. The panel today are the folks who are left to do the heavy lifting. So I want to introduce them briefly. I and the other moderators have agreed that we will we will provide just very brief introductions. You have detailed bios of each of the speakers in your program materials, and I'm guessing you'd rather hear from them than hear from me about all of their accomplishments. The format we're going to use is each of the 4 speakers will spend some time making comments. Most of them have PowerPoint presentations or overhead presentations, but they're just brief. It won't get lost in the detail. And then we're going to have a bit of a panel discussion. So with that in mind, let me introduce the 4 panelists, and I'll introduce them in the order that they're going to speak. First is Jeff McQuilkin. He is the Executive Director of the Mono Lake Committee. Next will be Marty Adams, the Director of Water Operations for the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power. Third will be Peter Vorster, a hydrogeographer at the Bay Institute and an independent consultant. And Mark Drew, who is the Eastern Sierra Regional Manager for CalTrout. So without further ado, let me introduce Jeff McQuilkin to start with a perspective on kind of the viability of the decision 20 years later, plus some of the subsequent decisions, including 9805 and the 2013 settlement agreement. The speakers will also talk about some of the challenges facing them with implementation and a bit about the applicability of the Mono decisions and the Mono experience with respect to other regions within the state. So again, without further ado, Jeff McQuilkin.
All right, thank you, Mary. It's great to see so many people here excited about Mono Lake. So many people in ties and coats excited about Mono Lake is excellent. I love that. This has been a wonderful event already. I want to thank Mike Kapersky and the whole team that's making it possible, because it's just a fantastic chance to talk about Mono Lake. And for a bit of a change, we didn't have to organize the entire thing in Lee Vining, and we really appreciate that. This is terrific. So I am going to take the task on of trying to connect the 20 years, as Mary alludes to, of work that have gone between the scene here of the State Water Board decision and the very active and engaged current set of things that are going on at Mono Lake. As David Cobb said, one of the remarkable things after you get over the public trust and the legal precedents and the decision itself, one of the remarkable things is that it wasn't appealed. It wasn't appealed by the city, it wasn't appealed by the committee, by Caltrat, by anybody. And that means we went right into an implementation approach for putting this decision into action. Some of the things that you'll find in the decision are very straightforward, what you'd expect from a water license. There's, of course, the management level for Mono Lake. There's, all right, I pushed that slowly. There's allocation of water to Los Angeles for export, about 300,000 acre feet over this 20-year period. There's minimum in-stream flows that were set. There's even, custom things, measure the level of Mono Lake. Very straightforward, though. Easy to track, compliance monitoring, you might say. Then there's some things in the decision that are more targeted towards seeing if the progress that was expected by the board and forecast by the board was being made. So there's a limnology program that looks at the water chemistry of Mono Lake and the brine shrimp population, so forth. There's a waterfowl population monitoring program that looks at the recovery of the populations of waterfowl that had declined. I think Debbie House is here, who runs that program for the department very ably. There's air quality monitoring done by the local air quality agency, looking at those dust storms and are they abating as the lake rises. There's even independent things, such as what the Mono Lake Committee does. We do an aerial census of eared grebe populations. A third of the North American population is on Mono Lake every fall. We want to know how many are out there. But these are all overshadowed by the complexity of the stream program that has gone forward from the decision and from the 1998 orders that followed the State Water Board decision that were really implementing a lot of the plans and the requirements. And so when you get into the stream program, it's an interesting situation because you're really trying to figure out not just how to measure something or protect something that exists, but you're trying to recover from the damage of the water diversion. So here's Lower Lee Vining Creek, probably the late 1970s. No forest, no water. We're a long, long way from there. But what we're trying to figure out is how to restore these streams. The Water Board had quite a bit of information. They did their best at the time to put that into action. Of course, water in the streams, that's pretty good for restoration. You want to have that flows. But they recognized, and I think this is one of the really unique things about the Water Board decision and important things, they recognized that the questions outnumbered the answers right then. And so they could give the start to a restoration program that would bring back the fisheries and bring back the riparian habitat on the 19 miles of streams that are downstream from the points of diversion. But they didn't know enough to write a plan that would last for eternity and guide us from the 1990s to the successful completion of that. And so they really jumped into kind of the cutting edge of resource management. Not sure if any of us knew that at the time, but it's talked about quite a lot today. Adaptive management, the idea that you have a long-term goal, that you set forth what those objectives are, and then you gather information along the way, and you use that information to actually inform your management, your decisions, and your actions. We've stolen this. I stole this graphic from the Bay Delta science folks, so it may look very familiar, but it's essentially what's been happening at Mono Lake. And one of the things I want to emphasize, and we'll get to the end of this, is that there's a lot of attempts to start a cycle of adaptive management, to set some goals at a policy level, and start the science process. But the tricky part is wrapping up that science, synthesizing it into a set of recommendations, bringing it back, and getting the policymakers to pay attention, actually incorporate it and turn it into the next round of decision making, because you're changing things, and that's always a challenge. So we're going to talk about Rush and Lee Vining, Parker and Walker Creeks here for just a bit. that's the focus of this adaptive management work. The board did set forth two very big picture, broad goals: self-sustaining, functional riparian stream systems, self-sustaining trout populations. So they tackled the big question. We know where we're going, and they tackled the big question of water allocation. We know how much goes to Los Angeles. We know how much stays in the basin and goes down the streams to the lake. It's a question of, within that framework, how do you get to the desired outcome? Some things are straightforward. Tree plantings. These are students from Los Angeles, Casa Esperanza, that work with our outdoor education program that we run cooperatively with the Department of Water and Power up in the Mono Basin. They're planting trees. So that's the kind of thing that can be done instantly. There are channel rewaterings, there are road closures to make sure there aren't impacts. There's a variety of measures that are taken. But over the past 15, 20 years, the big work has been in the science program. And the state board created two positions, stream scientists, one a geomorphologist, one a fisheries biologist, to advise the board, to report to the board, to oversee this work and gather the information and provide these adaptive management recommendations back to them. And so, we've got a few slides here. We've got some geomorphology work out there trying to figure out the structure of the stream, electrofishing, fisheries population monitoring, lots of this kind of thing. This is upstairs somewhere here in the building from a few years back. But notable, I think, these guys weren't sent off on their own on a 10-year quest to study things and come back and tell people who hadn't been engaged what was happening. The department's been involved, the committee's been involved, Caltrout's been involved. Of course, the State Water Board staff have been involved. And so it's been a program that's been developing, and people know where it's headed through time. There's no surprises. So take a very in-depth period of time, 10, 15 years of scientific study, and roll that all up into my 1 minute there. This led to the production of what we call the synthesis report in 2010. So this was written by the two expert scientists that were appointed, independent scientists, and it is kind of a synthesis of their findings and, most importantly, their recommendations on how to modify the stream flows and some other elements in the tributary streams to maximize the restoration benefit that will be achieved by that water being there. So good things have happened, no question there, but are we making the most of that water? And I think one of the things that's amazing about this process is it's gone from some very smart experts in the early phase who had spent some time in the Mono Basin to now working with folks who have spent decades in the Mono Basin. And what that means is we're not talking about, in general, how high stream flows could benefit pool scouring that create deep pools that fish will like. We're talking in specific about the type of substrate that's in Lower Rush Creek. And if you wanted to scour a pool here, how deep do the fish in Rush Creek like it to be? And how much water would you need to move the kind of cobbles that are in Rush Creek? Not in general, but specific there. And that led them to really be able to put together this remarkable set of flow recommendations to the state board that are called the stream ecosystem flows. And they are tailored to the streams. They have multiple components to them, and they are designed so that you could get from a desire to see the water flooding over the banks 4 miles downstream of the point of diversion into the aqueduct, and translate that backward all the way up the system and determine how much should be released from an aqueduct facility for what period of time to achieve that result. So this is just one example here of Rush Creek, and the type of change we're going to see. The lighter colored line there is the current flows. The darker line is the new flows. This would be a wet year, so we're just picking sort of a slice, one year type. The key thing, and maybe you can kind of see that there's some shading up there, bars on the top. And the key thing about the synthesis report and the motivation for them was that the higher flows move into these ranges in which key stream processes are activated. And you just don't get there unless you have the high flow. So pool scouring, delta building, point bar formation, flooding, seed deposition, all these things require higher flows than are currently being provided. And so they reshaped the hydrograph that would be released to figure out how to make the most of that water. So that, in some ways, would be easy, right? They make the recommendations. You're just changing how you turn the valves at what time of day, what time of year, so no problem. Just do it. Well, there were a few problems, and that led to a 3-year adventure that all of us have been involved in, and others, negotiating and trying to find a what we call the stream restoration settlement that was achieved last year. It was really going from the synthesis report and asking the question, can this be implemented? How can we implement it? DWP had some questions about whether the water amount that was being used really was staying within the box that the water board had allocated to the Mono Basin. Those are reasonable questions, and there was a lot of work done on that others will talk about. There were a variety of things. One I'll just highlight is in the slide is, and probably is familiar from other places in California, there were some infrastructure limitations. And so the idea of releasing the right amount of water into Rush Creek to match the recommendation is great, but the facility that exists, this is Grant Lake Reservoir, can't do that. And it can't do that because Marty Adams and the whole team are stuck with this infrastructure from the 1930s, which was designed for a very different purpose. It was not designed to balance fishery health and releases into streams with exports to Los Angeles. It was designed, as the quote says, to divert everything all of the time. And that's a different era. That era is gone, but the concrete infrastructure remains in the Mono Basin. So we had to go through a lengthy enterprise of trying to figure out how could we get to a solution that would modify this facility. How could that be done affordably? How could that be done reasonably? How could it be done in a way that works for Los Angeles, that's reliable, that we know will deliver the flows? And there are many stories to be told, but the good news is we actually did get there. As some of the press clippings show, I think we have the Maven here in the audience, right? So I'm glad I'm featuring that. There's Mark, there's Marty, there's me, right, downtown in Los Angeles. This was back last fall, and we did reach a settlement agreement. And the key thing about it from the committee's perspective is that we are taking the what, the science, and moving it into implementation. What we invested in was figuring out the how to make that workable for the department, for us, for everybody. This is just coming back to that question of the facilities and the outlet. This is Marty Adams here giving a demonstration to a group of how this facility, this is the spillway, the overflow spillway, will be modified going forward to be able to be a controlled release facility and release the kind of flows that are needed, but that's a very cost-effective way of doing it compared to some other options that we were looking at. So stream flows, now I should say that that was last fall, so now we're looking to get that through the process with the State Water Board, which had sent us off on this journey, this 3-year journey. They wisely said, you guys have a lot of differences of opinion, why don't you go figure it out and come back and tell us when you're done, which we did. So now it's being worked through and will ultimately be a license language for a new version of the diversion licenses in the Mono Basin. It's going to address the outlet, it addresses the stream flows, it looks at the next wave of monitoring on streams and fisheries going forward in a very functional way. It's a lesser program than it was because the scope of study is no longer needed to produce a synthesis report. We've done that phase, but it is still a robust program to see that the fishery goals and the stream goals are being met, to see that these new flows are working. So we've kind of chartered that new version of monitoring going forward. And it has many other components that others will touch on as well. I think what I'd like to highlight about this whole adventure on the streams is that it's given us the chance to test out this adaptive management idea. It's given the State Water Board the chance to test out how continuing implementation of an order and continuing public trust responsibility can work for them. Obviously, the board is not in a position to function like a parks agency and follow through on every detail of everything that happens in the Mono Basin. But on the other hand, they're involved for the long term. So how do we make that actually work? The adaptive management process has been very good. In the settlement, we've tried to structure it so some of the details are self-executing, but the board continues to be in charge of all of those to keep that workload manageable. And I think as we look to the future and we think about other changes that are out there, or challenges that are out there, climate change or changes in how lake dynamics work, the adaptive management approach that's worked well here is certainly a Mono Basin role model for going forward and meeting those challenges ahead. So that is my quick overview of 20 years. Oh, and you have to have, it's all connected, right? There's an osprey nesting on tufa, bringing in that trout that it just caught from a restored Rush Creek. So you gotta love that.
Thanks, Jeff. Marty?
Well, that last slide explains why there's not enough fish in Rush Creek right now, so I have to give my fishing game friends about that. Thank you for having me here today. It's I'm kind of the baby on the block. I've only been involved with the Eastern Sierra for about the last 5 years. When the Aqueduct group became part of my division downtown for operations, and as one of the folks asked earlier about people leaving the water system, my current boss was the first one who was not ever lived up in the Eastern Sierra, lived in Bishop, that heads the water system. I'll be taking over in 2 weeks from him, but at least I had the Aqueduct in my group for a while, and I worked on a couple of the most pressing issues, including this one, and then the recent settlements at Owens Lake, if you saw that in the news last Friday. So I would like to just try to explain a little bit in terms of the significance of this situation to LA in terms of water supply, what it means, and then what it means when we make these kind of decisions to the rest of the state, and then give you a little flavor for the experience that Los Angeles has gone through in terms of the last number of years at Mono Basin, and then looking forward to our plans for the future. I promised Mary that well, she said, keep it interesting, so I'll try not to get fired, but I'll try to keep it interesting. So our perspective is we've had a great partnership and a great relationship coming to where we're going to be heading in the future, but it's not been without some challenges. And certainly I was listening to the questions that came up earlier, and that inspired me to add a few more comments here. Before I get into the current situation, let me tell you about what's going on in Los Angeles. So just this past October, Mayor Garcetti put an executive directive forward looking at how LA is going to position itself for the future for water supply. And so one of the things he's called for is an integrated water strategy, really emphasizing local water supplies, looking at, if you've heard of the idea of one water. One water is the concept of, every bit of water is all related, and as we know, there's no new water. It's all the same stuff going around and around, and so it's a tie to the drinking water, the stormwater runoff, the water that comes out of wastewater treatment plants, and how this all looks at together in the future of the city, and actually the whole country is looking at this concept. Also, we're looking to reduce our purchased water on Metropolitan Water District by 50% in the next 10 years, and I'll get to how that plays into the Mono Lake decision. And then reduce our per capita water use by 20% in the next 2 years, which will be probably the single heaviest lift of any agency in the state's trying to come up with. This is the water picture that we have currently. So on the left, when I started 30 years ago with Water and Power, the LA Aqueduct was 70 to 75% of every year's water supply. And we've had a number of things. The Mono Lake decision was probably the single biggest hit. We used to average somewhere to up as far as 80 to 90,000 acre-feet a year out of Mono Basin. So that got reduced to 16,000 acre-feet a year. We've had a number of other judgments and agreements in the Owens Valley, having to do with the long-term water agreement, ranching commitments, other enhancement and mitigation projects, the restoration of Lower Owens River, and then most recently the Owens Lake dust mitigation project, which actually right now we're putting just shy. We've been putting as much water on Owens Lake as the city of San Francisco uses in a year. Right now we're just a hair under that amount. We've done a little bit of head work in conservation. But the LA Aqueduct, so right now what used to be 70 or 75% has been down to a long-term average now of just under 50%. And then if you look for the last number of years, because of the drought, it's been much less than that. And so where we celebrated the 100th anniversary of the aqueduct 2 years ago, we had the lowest year on record for deliveries. This last year, the 101st year, it was even lower than that. What that means is that when we don't bring water down the LA aqueduct, that we buy water from the Metropolitan Water District. And so this is where LA, because it's such a large player and is situated in such a way, whatever happens in LA, people think, well, it's only LA. It's never only LA. If it happens to LA, it happens to most everybody. And so because of where we are as a hinge point, when we don't have water from our own sources, and the little piece of pie is our local groundwater, which used to be a larger percent, but we lost about half our groundwater capacity due to contamination, industrial contamination, mostly stemming from World War II and after. When we lose those sources, we pull on supplies that everybody else in the state needs. So if you drive up the 5 freeway and you look at all the farming signs and all the dried irrigation area, that's water that might have been available, but it's in LA now. And so what are we doing for the future? So the graph on the right tells where we're going. So the aqueduct, this gets us back to ideally our long-term average on the LA aqueduct, reduces our take of Metropolitan Water District water, which for us is primarily the state water project, not so much Colorado River, because where we're geographically located. And it makes that water more available for the rest of the state. We get our local groundwater back by groundwater cleanup. We continue to do additional conservation measures. What's not shown on the graph on the left is that already in that graph, our water demands are down by over 100,000 acre-feet a year because of conservation. A number of people have mentioned that conservation started in LA as a result of this decision. So LA is a national leader in conservation. We save almost a year of water every 5 years. And so our per capita water use is considerably lower than most cities. And so that we would continue those efforts. And then there's also local water use, which is going to be a lot of stormwater capture and recycled water use. A lot of that becomes water supply as groundwater. And so we're looking to have our local supplies be a quarter of our water in the future. Just for a graph, this is where LA's water use is heading right now. This is a per capita water use. From comparison, if you're here in Sacramento, your water use on the left is almost twice as high as the highest bar. The per capita water use in LA is down about 130 gallons per person per day. We're going to drive that down by 20 more percent. So it's already reduced by 20%. It's going to go down another 20% in the next 2 years. We're going to change our water situation by using more recycled water. There's a lot of purple pipe systems going in. There's also groundwater recharge, more stormwater capture. It's heartbreaking to watch the water hit the streets in LA and run off as fast as it can to the LA River. And then by water conservation, and then have that materialize as local water supply by groundwater remediation. So that's the current picture for water in LA. And you can see that with the changes, when we lose water out of the Mono Basin, out of the Eastern Sierra or anywhere, we're looking to make up that water from Metropolitan Water District. In the future, we're looking to mitigate that impact on the rest of the state by increasing our local water supplies. So in terms of our work at the Mono Basin and regarding Mono Lake, one of the things that struck us, Justice Belize mentioned about the law, that there's not, the law says what the requirements are below a dam, and it's pretty clear what's required. The hard part as an agency is to put that into practice. And so I don't think there's ever been a case that's actually tried to weigh what fish in good condition means. And that was one of the things that we struggled with in this, is people had different opinions of what was normal. There's no way you can put a dam in a stream and hold back any amount of water and have it at absolutely the same condition downstream in the future. So I guess, so there will be an impact, and that's one thing we know is that, so what's the degree of that impact, and how do you mitigate that? We looked at stream conditions as actually being pretty favorable. You've seen pictures that Jeff put up and others have put up about Rush Creek. I actually walked Rush Creek when it was dry in the late 80s as a young engineer. I had no idea where I was or the significance of it or any of the battles going on around it. But I remember walking in the creek bed. We'd stayed overnight at Cane Ranch, and little did I know that later on that would be, it was already the center of some controversy, and then later on would be a beautiful restored creek. Why do we think it was in good condition? This is an interesting look. We have a lot of biologists. We used to have 2 biologists that worked in the Eastern Sierra. We have, my last count was 21. We might have been up from that already. And so mitigation and restoration is a key part of what we do as our business. There's a lot of anecdotal stories about Rush Creek. We look at pictures of the fish coming out of Rush Creek, following the synthesis report presentation talking about the need for more work and the need to improve the fisheries. one of the fish and game people I saw the next day in the Bishop office and said, oh, there's probably more brown trout in Rush Creek than anywhere in the state of California. So there's this anecdotal disconnect between what we see and then what we hear, and exactly what we're told and what the so kind of thinking, well, so should the targets be here? On the scientific studies, so we had about 13 years of scientific studies. We spent about $6 million on the scientific studies, not counting what we do with our regular staff. And so we know that the studies looked at limnology in Mono Lake. We looked at the creek flow, the creek health conditions, and not only Rush, but Levining and Walker and Parker. And so one of the thoughts on the studies is that we believe when the synthesis report came out that would be the final conclusions of what would be needed, and then we'd have a roadmap for the future. That the idea that the state put forward guidelines, and they said, these are the guidelines to follow for flows. We're going to do a long, thorough study, and then when we're done with that, we'll have better guidelines. And so that's sort of where we are, but not exactly where we ended up being. We ended up with, when the report came out, we had a lot of consternation. One of the questions was Water and Power going to challenge the report? Were we going to go to the state board? Because we had recommendations that said, we think the stream's restored, we think we're done. Everybody else said, we think there's more work to do, and we'd like to see how we handle this. So one of the things we did, actually, our former aqueduct manager suggested, he said, we have a great process at Owens Lake, where we've actually brought in the Center for Collaborative Studies from Cal State Sacramento, and had a mediator and said, let's try this at Rush Creek. So we tried that there, and the idea was that we would get all the parties together and try to find the common ground and try to find what we could do. One of the first things we found is that the comment earlier was that there's no perfect modeling. Well, it's really not perfect when everyone's using their own model. And so one of the first things we did was hash out which models to use. And one of the things that happens, a lot of people don't want to share data. People don't want to share models or share techniques, or especially if it's a proprietary model. And so one of the key things we did was get to sharing the science, and actually came on, and Peter was key to this, came up, I'm taking this whole speech probably, so he came up to an agreement on what are we all looking at, and are we all looking at the same thing through the same pair of glasses. So that was really key, and so sharing the science and sharing the techniques was a big thing. The next question was, in terms of what we could do, what about costs and physical challenges? We knew that we'd spent a good amount of money studying the system in the past. There's a question about studying in the future. And so we actually, at the end of this all, came to an agreement we're actually going to spend more money continuing to study in the future for more adaptive management than we have in the last 12 years, just resetting the rules. A question about how much can you do physically in terms of changing the flows. Jeff showed a slide of the flow changes. And these flow changes are good on paper, but when you're talking 70-year-old facilities that are about 65, 70 feet deep in the ground, and they're large valves that don't like to move, there's only so much you can physically do to control it. And then you try to change a flow in a stream where the stream could take hours to respond to that flow. And so, you could fish around looking for a flow for a long time. So there's some practical applications. The rules look good on paper, but the question is, how do you put this into reality in the real world? And so this was something that we had to deal with. The last thing that came up was understanding everyone's real positions. One of the difficult things, and I think that in retrospect, looking back, 12 years ago, we probably should have brought in maybe a third party who would have been viewed as independent. One of the problems working for the person who is, I say the accused or the guilty, or whichever you want to look at it, working for the agency who is responsible, is that you're in a situation that no matter what you do scientifically, there's always a question. Debbie House, raise your hand. Debbie House is here. Debbie's our state-appointed waterfowl person, and it's amazing. She's done a great job. She's on top of the birds. She does walks and talks for the Mono Lake Committee and a lot of things with the public on weekends. Done an outstanding job, but unfortunately, because she works for DWP, she's carrying that stain. And so there's a question over, can you trust a public agency to do its job? And so this is something that's become a real issue, and something that we're still trying to work through with the state board, is that how do we move ahead? Can we move ahead? How much should we do ourselves? How much should somebody else do? Because then if the idea is that the science will be more objective somehow. I have a tremendous confidence and trust in our scientists, but everybody has to be on the same page, and if it's not shared, then you'll never get to the answers that you want that everyone will agree to. And so one of the keys to this is that you have to get to some set of data, some set of answers, some condition that everybody thinks is the same and thinks is correct. And at some point, you have to look in the mirror and say, well, if they're not going to believe what I say, then let's find someone we all agree on, and we'll work that way. And so hopefully, in our stream monitoring, that'll come out in the future. The next steps, I should probably change the slide. The slides kind of gives background. The next steps, as Jeff said, we are going to change the spillway at Grant Lake. One of the questions is, how do you get these high flows when you have a dam in the middle and you can't deliver it? In this case, we're trying to replicate Mother Nature. Interestingly, because the system is also controlled upstream by Edison, in this case, Grant Lake is the only reason we can replicate Mother Nature. And so it is somewhat ironic that without the existence of Grant Lake, we could not have the restoration flows that were desired. And so in this case, the dam caused a problem, but it also will be the solution to the problem that if the dam wasn't there, the high flows would not be maintained. We are looking at what happens as the lake level continues to drop. I think Peter will show lake levels in a minute, and we're almost to the point where we're going to lose another 11,500 acre feet of export from Mono Basin. One of the key things that strikes me in all of this, because I'm running out of time in the last few seconds, is the mic going to cut off? No. One of the key things that strikes me about this situation, and you take it beyond just the Mono Basin or Rush Creek or Levining Creek, is that no matter where you live in California, there are impacts by living here if you drink water. And there's no way to escape that. And so LA, probably because of the way we went about things, and certainly if you look at our history in the Eastern Sierra as being kind of one of the first cities that did a lot of diversions, we've had a different, somewhat different treatment as to how we've had to deal with these. But there is no city in California, unless you live in the North Coast, where you don't take water from somewhere that's really not close to you and have some impact from that. We know in Rush Creek that the trout that we're protecting were introduced in the 1870s. We know that in 1923, Edison started diverting water from the creek at the power plant upstream. We know that in 1941, when we built the dam, that the water did not cross the 395 freeway. It was all used up for cattle and sheep irrigation, for grazing, but it reoccurred as spring flow down below. But that spring flow had a lot of nutrients in it, and that helped form the biomass. One of the interesting things that I asked one of the scientists when they presented the synthesis report, there's concern about biomass and that there's not enough biomass. And the comment they made is, well, trout don't really like to live in the Eastern Sierra. They're not native to it. And so we have to do something. So, you kind of get this. There's a picture that someone picked a point in time that they like that point in time, and that's what we're going to replicate. And, if you picked 1800, it'd be a different picture. If you picked 1900, it'd be a different picture. So the date that the picture is taken is a very interesting thing. But no matter what we do, there will be impacts from where we live, and we will not be able to mitigate every bit of it. And so it is important as we look at a solution like something like the Mono Lake decision, and we look at the far-reaching impacts from that. The impact is not just the Mono Basin. The impact is water supply. It's essentially life in California at some point. And so we have to really look at all those impacts. You have to look at, the day in history. You could talk about Bay Delta issues and say, well, I want Bay Delta issues, I want it a certain way. Well, the Delta is nothing like what it was naturally. I want to protect striped bass. They're not natural. And there's a lot of things. So the date that we draw a line in history becomes critical for the discussion. And you really can't avoid that and taking a serious look at that, because as you draw different points in time for each situation in California, you'll have a history that doesn't match. And so you'll say, well, I want this date here, this date here, this date here. And it'll be difficult to manage all the impacts if you pick the most optimum time that everybody liked the picture right then. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Marty. Peter?
Well, I think what you've learned from the talk so far is that the first session, a lot about Mono Lake and the alkali fly, not brine fly, alkali fly, and brine shrimp, the birds. We learned a lot about the streams now and the fish, that, as Marty pointed out, the non-native fish. But what I want to make a point here. I'm just going to cover these 3 points, and this first point will be about the progress of restoration, and then I'll talk about managing the expectations that we have in a changing climate, and then what we've learned about in the implementation and decision making in the last 20 years. Next. But I want to actually stop and have all of you recognize the fact that we're dealing with a decision, the first time it applied the public trust in the early 90s, first with a monumental CEQA document and in the 43 days and nights of hearing. And I want to commend the Water Board for this is the first time they did this. It was a big deal, and they looked at the public trust, and they looked in a very expansive way. It was a lot more than just seagulls and brine shrimp. It was actually more than the fish. And so there's a lot that's going into what we're trying to restore here. And I want to read a passage that was written in 1981 by William Carl, who's actually in the audience today, wrote a seminal history of the Owens Valley water history. And I'm going to read what he wrote, and I think reflects what at the time was the thinking of Los Angeles. But for the successors of William Mulholland, the real stuff of nightmares must consist in the thought that a significant part of the work of 3/4 of a century might be undone for the sake of some tiny shrimp and a flock of birds. Marty, are we your worst nightmare? Okay. Well, that's exactly. And so think about that. The evolution, not only in what Marty said, but the evolution of, it's not just seagulls and brine shrimp. In fact, the seagulls kind of faded from relevance for a number of reasons. And we heard some about it. So one of the things that we've tried to do in the last 20 years is restore the conditions and the process, and that the process is very important, that would enable, that not only benefit the fishery, but benefit all the other public trust ecosystem values, such as the bottomlands of Rush Creek, a multi-story riparian vegetation, wooded wetland, wide, multiple channel system with high groundwater across it. Well, what's the big deal about that? Well, the big deal about that is that's a very rare and unique environment, especially in the Great Basin, given that all the other places where that once existed, whether it was on the Truckee River, the Carson River, the Walker River, it's all gone, essentially, mostly gone. In the Mono Basin, it was almost gone, and we actually have the opportunity to restore some of that. Not all of it, but some of it on Rush and Levining Creek and perhaps on Mill Creek. So what we're doing is restoring what was a habitat that no one really knew about, how important it was. Well, how important is it? In the last 20 years, by restoring the flows, by rewatering some of the bottomland channels, we've been able to restore the densest population of yellow warblers in the state. I think I heard as high as 10% of the state's population of yellow warblers. They weren't there before. I mean, when, as Marty said, when it was dry, you're not going to get a lot of yellow warblers. So I think I just want people to appreciate the kind of progress we've made and the fact that it's much more than a flock of birds and tiny shrimp. The other thing that we've realized in the last 20 years and through the monitoring we've seen is this is a very dynamic ecosystem responding to both